I never expected her to remember my name, let alone everything else. It was Thursday, and the coffee shop smelled like steamed milk and the faint dust of old books from the shelf in the corner. I'd come here enough to have a regular order, a black coffee, 2 sugars, no milk, always in the same chipped ceramic mug. Somehow, she remembered it. "Hey, Dylan," she said, voice soft, warm without trying. She was behind the counter, tying her apron with the faintest shrug of her shoulders, a little crease by her mouth that made her look like she'd just heard a secret. I hesitated. Hey, Mrs. Harper." Her eyes flicked to mine and held. Not for too long, but long enough that I felt the ghost of a smile in the corner of my chest. Then she nodded and started pouring the coffee. "Still black?" she asked. I nodded, feeling a little stupid for how small that exchange made my heart race. She handed me the mug, fingers brushing mine for a brief, accidental second. I didn't pull away, not immediately. I took my usual seat by the window, where the light pooled in rectangles across the wooden table. Outside, someone had left their umbrella leaning against the curb. I noticed because I paused, half expecting to see her out there in the drizzle, though why would she be? I had a habit of coming here to feel less invisible. Not invisible in a dramatic, lonely hero way, but in those tiny, paused moments where I remembered no one really noticed the small details about me. The unsent texts I wrote to friends I barely called, the half-finished sentences I left in my head. Sometimes I imagined talking to her about all that, though I'd never actually say a word. She moved behind the counter, humming low, arranging croissants in a display. I watched her hands, the careful fold of a napkin under a pastry tray, the way her fingers lingered just slightly too long on the edge. She didn't know I was watching, or maybe she did. I couldn't tell. "You look tired," she said suddenly, placing a slice of banana bread near the register. She looked at me like she expected an answer, but I just shrugged. "Long week," I murmured. She nodded as if she understood entirely, then returned to arranging pastries. And just like that, she disappeared into the rhythm of the morning, and I was left staring at my coffee, noticing the way the steam swirled, imagining it wrapping around us, softening the edges of everything I was too shy to say. I'd been here maybe 15 minutes when she leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. "You know, I still keep that old picture of you from the summer barbecue. By the porch." Something hit my chest like a small, sudden weight. I laughed, awkward, a little off, trying not to show I remembered the photo too. How she'd laughed at the ridiculous sunburn on my nose. How her eyes had crinkled at the corners when she shook her head at my terrible summer haircut. "You still have that," I said, voice quieter than I expected. She shrugged, and there was that tiny pause, that delicate shift in her shoulders, before she smiled softly. "Some things are hard to throw away." I nodded, but I didn't know what I was agreeing to exactly. Outside, a bus screeched to a stop, someone's bag thumped against the bench, and I realized I hadn't breathed properly in a few minutes. Then, just as I was leaving, she said, "There's a reading tomorrow night. You should come." And I froze, halfway out the door, the bell chiming above me, the world continuing as if nothing had shifted, even though everything had. I wanted to ask if she meant it, but instead, I just nodded a little too quickly and walked away, heart ticking like the clock on the far wall, wondering if I'd ever see her like that again. I found myself back at the coffee shop the next evening, not because of the reading she'd mentioned, I wasn't sure I'd go, but because something about the way she remembered that old photo kept nudging me. She was closing early, wiping down the counter, the hum of the refrigerator louder than usual in the quiet room. "You're early," she said, noticing me hovering by the door. Her voice was casual, but the way she lifted an eyebrow made me pause. "Just walking," I muttered. "Needed some air." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes entirely. There was something behind them, a subtle crease of thought I couldn't read. I leaned against the counter, unsure why I felt like I couldn't leave. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked, jerking the question out before I could stop myself. She looked at me, a little startled, then laughed softly, brushing her hair back with one hand. "Miss what?" "The summers." "That, everything," I said, waving vaguely toward the counter. "The shop, Maybe even the years I'd only seen through snapshots and recollections. She paused, resting her elbows on the counter. Sometimes, she said quiet. But life has a way of moving the important parts forward, and the rest, well, it lingers where it can. There was a weight in her words, like she was sharing more than she intended. I imagined the stories behind her smile. A divorce, maybe, kids grown and gone, small regrets tucked in the corners of her life. I wanted to ask, but I didn't. Instead, I offered to help her clear the chairs, stacking them a little too carefully, hoping she'd notice. She watched me, then reached for a stray napkin on the floor, and for a second our hands brushed. I didn't pull away. I always liked how organized you are, she said, almost as if to fill the silence. But the way she said it made my chest tighten. Not a compliment about me, exactly, but about noticing me. I laughed nervously. It's a bad habit, I admitted. Or maybe a quiet way to not think too much. Her eyes lingered on mine, and I wondered if she caught the thought I didn't voice, that maybe I'd been thinking about her all week. About the old photo, the way her laughter made the air feel smaller, how I imagined walking home with her at my side, though I knew that could never happen. We moved in silence for a few more minutes, side by side, the small clatter of dishes punctuating the pause. Then she touched my shoulder lightly, a fleeting brush that stayed longer than necessary. I felt my pulse in my ears. I'll see you tomorrow, maybe, she said, soft, almost a question. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. She gave me a small, fleeting smile and returned behind the counter. Walking home, I replayed the moment over and over, noticing how her gaze followed me for just a second longer, how the touch lingered in memory, not in reality. I didn't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. I didn't expect to see her at the park, of all places, but there she was, sitting on the bench near the fountain, sketchbook open on her lap. The light was low, the kind that made everything look like it could blur into memory if you weren't careful. "Hey," I said, slowing my steps. She glanced up, a quick smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Dylan." She closed the sketchbook abruptly, as if hiding something. I sat beside her, careful not to crowd. There was a hesitation, a gap that felt wider than it should. "Thought you might be here," I said, though I didn't. She shrugged, fingers drumming the edge of the paper. "Needed to think." Her voice trailed, and I didn't press. I wanted to, but I didn't. We walked in silence for a few blocks afterward, the city humming around us. I wanted to talk, but every sentence I started dissolved in my chest. She glanced at me once, then looked away, catching a pigeon in mid-flight, folding her hands in her coat pockets. I didn't know if you'd come," she said finally, voice low, cautious. "Yeah." My voice sounded too loud in the quiet street. I looked at her, noticing the lines near her eyes that deepened when she smiled faintly, the way her coat hung loosely on her frame. She was real, too real. We passed the small bookstore she liked, and I suggested we step in. Browsing the shelves side by side felt safe and intimate, the air thick with paper and dust. She reached for a copy of some poetry collection. Our hands brushed. Not a quick touch, a pause, lingering a second too long. I almost said something. Almost. But I let it go. Then someone called out, "Mrs. Harper." Her head snapped toward the voice. A woman from her book club waved, cheerful, unaware of how it cut through the quiet space between us. She straightened, smiling politely, and I felt the distance grow instantly, a sharp edge I hadn't noticed before. When the woman left, she said nothing. She tucked the book under her arm, hands gripping it just a little too tightly. I wondered if she noticed my eyes tracing her fingers, or if she cared. We walked again, slower now, the space between us measured, cautious. A pause at a crosswalk, a car idling too close. She turned toward me, and for a brief second, it was just us. My heart stuttered. I started. Stopped. Words tangled. She tilted her head, eyes soft. "What?" "Nothing," I said, swallowing. But I wanted to tell her everything. The photo, the coffee, the week of imagining her smile in my chest. I wanted to reach for her hand, just once, but I froze. We stood there, side by side, the crosswalk light ticking down. My fingers twitched, and I noticed her breath, the warmth of her coat brushing my arm. So close. And then the light changed. She stepped forward. I stepped too. Almost. Almost. Almost crossed the line we'd both danced around. And then, just like that, it was gone. The city carried us forward, separate, and I realized how quickly I'd forgotten the space of my own body in that one heartbeat, how sharply I'd missed it as soon as it was over. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the blinds of the cafe, dust motes drifting lazily in the warm air. I sat across from her, hands wrapped around my mug, noticing the way her fingers traced the rim absent-mindedly. She hadn't said much, just sipped her tea, but her silence felt heavier than any words. "You're quiet today?" I said, testing the water. She looked up, eyes catching mine for a moment longer than usual. "Not everything needs saying," she murmured, and I wanted to argue, wanted to fill the space, but I stayed quiet. We had walked here together after work, a rare moment we carved out without errands or errands disguised as excuses. And yet, as we sat, I felt a tight knot in my chest. I'd imagined her with someone else today, a laugh I didn't hear, a hand that wasn't mine, the idea worse than anything she could actually do. I don't like it when my voice broke, unpracticed. I trailed off, embarrassed. She leaned forward slightly, just enough that our knees nearly touched. "When what?" "When I think someone else is with you." The words stumbled out like they'd been hiding too long. I felt my face flush, but I didn't pull away. Her eyes softened. She put down her cup, fingers lingering on the edge of the table. "Dylan." She didn't finish, and that unfinished sound carried more weight than I could handle. I watched her, memorizing the way her hand moved, the quiet pause of her breath, the small crease between her eyebrows when she considered how to answer. It was intimate, too intimate, and yet impossibly safe. "I know I shouldn't." I started again, more carefully this time. "I shouldn't feel this way. I know it's complicated." She nodded slowly. "It is." A few moments passed. The cafe hummed around us. A low murmur of conversation, a chair scraping the floor, a barista calling out an order. We were islands in that ordinary noise, caught in a shared gravity neither of us could name. I wanted to tell her everything, how her laugh stayed in my chest, how her memory followed me like a shadow, how I'd imagined this exact moment a dozen times. But the words felt too dangerous. She reached for her tea again, and I noticed the tremor in her fingers. A subtle one, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. It made my throat tighten. "Do you ever wonder," I whispered, voice barely carrying across the table, "if maybe we could?" Her eyes met mine, wide and honest, and the question hung between us like a thread stretched too thin. She didn't answer. She only tilted her head, lips parted slightly, as if weighing the impossibility against the desire. And in that pause, the world shrank to the space between our faces, our unspoken understanding and fear, the moment before everything, or nothing, could change. I wanted to reach across the table, touch her hand, lean closer, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I swallowed, heart pounding, and let the silence speak instead. Would she move, or would she wait? The next week, she didn't show up at the coffee shop. I waited, more than once, hovering by the counter, scanning the door as if I might catch her in some ordinary moment, but she didn't come. Her apron was folded neatly behind the counter, untouched, and the manager gave me a polite, almost sympathetic smile. I tried not to think too much about it. I told myself she was busy, that it was nothing. But my footsteps hesitated each morning, and my mug felt heavier in my hands, like it carried the weight of all the words I didn't send her. When she finally appeared, it was late, and she was quieter than usual, eyes flicking away whenever they met mine. She didn't ask about the reading, didn't joke about the photo. The small gravity between us, the one that made my chest ache in quiet anticipation, had shifted. I started, then stopped, the sentence unraveling before it left my mouth. She folded her hands over the counter. "There's things I haven't told you," she said. Pause. Her voice dropped. "About my life. About why some things are complicated." I nodded, heart hammering. Dylan," she cut me off gently. It's not fair to you. Or anyone. I just need to. Her words trailed into silence, unfinished. The air felt thicker, the ordinary hum of the cafe amplified. I wanted to ask, but the courage I'd held the last time was gone. The thought of pushing, of demanding her story, felt too heavy. Instead, I watched her move, watched the faint tremor in her hands as she straightened napkins, the same subtle gesture that had once made my chest tighten. I imagined what she might be hiding: a divorce, a grown child, someone waiting at home. Details that might change everything if I knew. The air between us seemed suddenly fragile, almost breakable. I tried to speak again, rehearsed a small joke about the banana bread or the mug I always used. But it felt hollow. She smiled faintly, a courtesy more than connection, and the pull I had felt for weeks began to feel like a rope slipping through my fingers. Days passed. I stopped stopping by the cafe, or at least, I told myself I did. I waited instead for a message that didn't arrive, for a glance that never came. The empty chair across from me, at my usual table, felt sharper than any words. One evening, I drafted a message. Typed it, deleted it, typed it again. Nothing felt right. The cursor blinked at me like it knew something I didn't. I left it unsent. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. I walked past the cafe that night, lights warm inside, people chatting softly, and for a brief second I thought I saw her behind the counter. But when I blinked, she was gone, the door swinging closed behind someone else. The world carried on, indifferent, leaving my chest hollow, and me holding a phone full of words I'd never speak. I found her in the small kitchen of her apartment, sunlight slanting through the half-closed blinds. The kettle whistled softly, steam curling like it had a life of its own. She was arranging mugs on the counter, moving slowly, deliberately, as if the ordinary task could steady whatever tremor she felt inside. I stood in the doorway, hands shoved in my pockets, unsure if I should step forward or retreat. My chest ached in that familiar way, not dramatic, not urgent, just the subtle pull of something I couldn't name. "You came," she said softly, without turning. Yeah," I muttered, voice low. "I wanted to. I don't know. Talk." She paused, the mug in her hands trembling a little. I noticed, suddenly, how careful she was with every movement, the weight of her hesitation pressing against the walls. "I wasn't sure you'd, after last week," she said, finally looking at me. Eyes steady but guarded. I swallowed. "I shouldn't have assumed anything," I said, stepping closer, just a little. I needed to see you." There was a silence that stretched long enough for the kettle to stop whistling, long enough for dust motes to drift lazily in the sunlight. My mind raced with all the things I hadn't said, the careful rehearsals I had played over and over in my head. And then I realized, if I didn't speak now, I might never get another chance. I've been thinking about you," I said, voice almost too quiet. "About the photo, the coffee, the everything. I didn't mean to make it complicated, but I can't not think about it." Her hands froze on the mug. I watched her swallow, small, careful, the tiniest nod that seemed to weigh 1,000 words. "You know," she began, then stopped, unsure, her breath catching in the smallest way. She folded her arms, then unfolded them again, finally letting her hands rest on the counter. "I felt it too," she admitted, quiet, almost as if saying it out loud might make it vanish. "I've just worried about what it would mean. About the rest of the world." I nodded, fingers itching to reach for hers, but holding back, honoring the fragility of this moment. "Yeah," I said softly. "Me too." We stood there, the ordinary kitchen around us humming with sunlight and quiet noise. Nothing cinematic, nothing dramatic. Just us, two people who had been circling the edges of something impossible and necessary, finally letting the tension ease. She finally smiled, small, careful, a little crooked, and it was enough. Enough to make the hesitation, the pause, the weeks of unsent words, all feel worth it. I exhaled slowly, the ache in my chest softening. "Okay," I said, voice low, almost a whisper. "Okay," she echoed, letting the single word bridge the space between us. And that was it. No grand declarations, No sudden rush. Just a moment, quiet, human, painfully real, where the weight of everything unsaid finally settled. Weeks passed. Life moved in its ordinary rhythms. The small hum of the city around us, the ritual of black coffee each morning, the faint smell of bread from the corner bakery. I found her at the coffee shop again one Thursday, same chipped mug in hand, and she gave me a small smile, one that said nothing but everything. We didn't announce anything. No grand declarations. No rushed confessions. Just small moments that stitched themselves into familiarity. A shared table by the window, lingering over tea when the cafe was nearly empty, our knees brushing under the table, hands accidentally touching as we reached for the sugar. One Saturday, we walked past the fountain in the park, the same bench where we'd once almost crossed a line we weren't ready for. She laughed quietly at something someone else said, the sound soft and measured, and I noticed the way the light caught the edge of her hair. I realized then that I no longer ached with the longing I had carried. It had settled into something warmer, steadier. We'd fallen into a rhythm. The small teasing over whose turn it was to refill the kettle, the way she folded a napkin when I left my teacup on the counter, the unspoken understanding that sometimes silence was enough. I'd stopped imagining conversations. I was living them, in fragments and pauses, perfectly imperfect. There were mornings she arrived before me. I would watch her from the doorway, steam curling from her mug, her fingers brushing the rim as she rearranged chairs, and I felt the quiet joy of recognition, of being noticed, truly, without needing to say a word. And sometimes, when she caught my gaze, she'd flick her eyes toward her hands, a little gesture that had become ours, a tiny language we understood. We weren't perfect. There were still moments of hesitation, a pause before a joke, a slight distance when life's weight pressed too hard. But the tension that had once threatened to unravel us had softened into something reliable. One evening, I arrived at her apartment with a thermos of black coffee, the one she said she liked in the mornings, and we drank it together at the counter, sunlight falling across the floorboards. She didn't comment, and I didn't either. We just existed in that shared space, the quiet hum of the kettle, the ordinary motion of refilling cups, the touch of her fingers against mine as I handed her the thermos. Later, as I walked home, I realized I no longer needed grand moments to define what we had. It was in the small, lingering gestures, the silences that carried meaning, the warmth of ordinary mornings. And somewhere between the steam and the light, I thought of that old photograph she still kept, the summers past, and the weeks we'd circled around one another, hesitant. And I smiled quietly to myself, because she'd remembered, I'd shown up, and somehow, quietly, beautifully, we had arrived here together. I glanced at my watch. 8:47 a.m. exactly like old times. I imagined her with her coffee, and I felt that familiar, gentle ache of knowing someone sees you. The kind of ache that doesn't demand more than itself, and yet feels like home. If this were for a video script, you could close with, "Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next?"